Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the fourth and final webinar in the 2014 Training and Technical Assistance Program. My name is Cassandra Lovejoy, and I'm with the National Energy Assistance Directors Association, and I'll be helping out today. Today we're going to be discussing client files. Our speaker is Yulia Razad from the Administration for Children and Families. We will be having an open Q&A session at the end, so please hold all of your questions until the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Yulia.
Thank you, Cass, and thank you everybody for joining us for our final webinar of fiscal year 2014. We are anxiously wrapping up our fiscal year and reviewing all of your LIHEAP plans. Thank you everyone for submitting those. We know it's been kind of a rough go of it using OLDC for the first time this year to submit the model plan. We appreciate your patience as we all deal with the technical glitches that come along with that. But today we will be talking about monitoring client files. And we'll be covering several topics. The purpose of a client file, what elements make up a good client file, what types of documents should be in every file, and then internal and external monitoring processes. So why even have client files? Client files really represent in LIHEAP the implementation of your policies and procedures. And so the idea behind having a client file is to have a compilation of all the records and documents and information that you have collected to provide LIHEAP services. A LIHEAP client file should tell the whole story of a client's LIHEAP process, from the application point to the processing of a benefit and potentially any refunds that come into play. And that story should be very clear to anyone reviewing the file. In many cases, LIHEAP client files seem pretty clear to the person putting them together, but then when you have someone outside of the organization look at them, they can be confusing or disorganized. So when you're putting your client files together, you should always think, would somebody understand what this is all about if they didn't know anything about LIHEAP? So how do you make a file easily understandable to someone who is not familiar with LIHEAP? So there's a few rules you can follow. First, and very obviously, the file should be readable, and so everything in the file should be legible and in an order that makes sense. It should be certified. In other words, if you have requirements where applications must be signed by the client and also by the intake worker, then those documents should be signed and dated as per your rules. The files should be transparent. In other words, it should be very clear to anyone looking through the file what the steps were taken in order to determine eligibility, determine a benefit amount, and process a payment. And finally, the files should be consistent so that all the files should more or less look like each other. They should be in the same order. They should have the same forms. If you have color-coded forms, stick to the same color coding. So that files resemble one another as much as possible for the sake of consistency and ease of understanding. So client files don't necessarily need to be hard copy. You can have electronic files or paper files, but both versions must contain all documents that are necessary. If you do choose to have electronic files, you need to make sure that if you are scanning documents or photocopying them and then scanning them, that all of those copies are legible, that if you're going to make copies of Social Security cards, that you could actually read the Social Security number and the name that's on the card so you can compare it to what's written on the application. If you're going to be making copies of income documentation, everything should be legible on those copies when they get scanned and saved electronically. The files should be easily accessible. And here you need to strike a balance between ease of accessibility and confidentiality. Client files should only be available to people who work directly with them. They shouldn't be available to other people in the office or people who do not work on LIHEAP intake or LIHEAP benefit processing. So we recommend that files are kept in locked cabinets, or if they're electronic, through password-protected software or a password-protected computer, that everyone who accesses those files has their own password, that you're not sharing passwords. And it's very important to make sure that the private information of your clients is kept confidential. They're giving you a lot of information. They're giving you their social security numbers. They're giving you their dates of birth. Bad things can happen if that kind of information gets into the wrong hands, and so it's very, very important that all of that documentation is safeguarded. You should maintain your client files in attention to your own file retention policies. We get a lot of questions from grantees that ask us, how long do we have to keep the files? When can we shred them? We're running out of room in our filing cabinets. What do we do? And our response to that is that, as the grantee, you're responsible for developing a policy on file retention. That policy should be in writing. It shouldn't be just something you agree to verbally among your staff. You should have a policy that says we will keep files for 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, after which we will dispose of them in this manner. And once that policy is established, you should be following that policy for all of your paper files for LIHEAP. We recommend that when you retain them, when you retain client files and after they've exceeded their retention period, that you shred them, not just simply recycle them, so you can make sure that all of the private information that you have for all of your clients is not easily accessible by people digging through recycling bins. It's also really important to make sure that if you have electronic files, that you have a backup for them so that you don't have them all saved on one computer and that computer crashes and you lose all of your information. Or if you have your files saved on a flash drive, for example, you should have a backup so if that flash drive gets corrupted, you're not in a position where you have lost all your year's worth of data. We've gotten many frantic phone calls from grantees saying, our computer crashed or our basement flooded, we lost all of our files. I would say if you live in a floodplain, do not keep your client files in the basement, because if they flood, you cannot get them back. So it's really important to make sure you have a backup for electronic files and that you have a plan in place for retaining paper files in a manner where you feel relatively confident that they won't get destroyed. So client files play an important role apart from documentation. They protect your staff and they protect the grantee as an entity in case of client complaints or accusations of fraud. Everyone is familiar with client complaints. LIHEAP intake workers are often accused of acting unfairly, giving somebody more money than their neighbor, denying somebody even though someone across the street makes more money but they were approved, et cetera, et cetera. And your client file is the way that you protect yourself against such accusations, so you can very clearly show the documented steps taken to make every decision for each client. It's also important if someone is accused of fraud that you have documentation to back that up or to refute it as appropriate. Client files are also the way that you prove that you have expended LIHEAP funds properly. They're very important when the program is monitored, both internally by your own organization and externally by auditors or by our office. The files need to show that you have followed your procedures properly and that you have spent LIHEAP funds on appropriate activities. And so if you do not have these records to demonstrate this, this can result in disallowed costs if your program is monitored. Client files also make it much easier for new intake workers to get trained. You can almost have them look through, a month's worth of files to get a sense of what kind of documentation is acceptable, what kind of processes take place when you make a eligibility and benefit determination. So you can use your files as a training tool as well as a tool for documentation and decision making. And so this is just a preliminary list of the types of things that we expect to see when we look at a client file. And first, most importantly, is the signed application. Every application should be signed by the applicant, by the LIHEAP client or the head of household, if your policies require that signature. A file should have verification of identity. So what kind of documentation did you collect for the applicant and the household members to prove that they're just not, names scribbled on a piece of paper? Did you collect copies of their IDs or copies of their social security cards? Or did you verify the household makeup using a database from another social service program? That type of documentation should all be included in the file. Next, you should also be documenting the size of the household. You can list all the household members and their dates of birth and social security numbers on an application, or you can confirm the household makeup from records of other social service programs. But regardless of the process you take, there should be some documentation of the size of the household because the benefit amount that you issue is dependent on the size of the household. You shouldn't just have somebody write down how many household members there are and that be the end of the story. There needs to be some sort of documentation to show evidence of that. Even if that documentation is self-declared, like everyone's names and dates of birth, you should be asking for that type of information. Next, you need documentation of energy cost or need. So this may be your most recent electricity or gas bill, or your most recent invoice for propane or fuel oil. There should be something in the client file that shows that the client has a responsibility for some portion of their home energy. Because if the client isn't paying anything for any portion of their home energy, then they really shouldn't be receiving LIHEAP to begin with. So that documentation should also be in the file. Next, you need income. Evidence of income or a signed statement of no income declaration. So many people are already collecting income documentation. But when you have 3 or 4 adults in the household, you have to assume that each adult has some sort of income. Otherwise, you should be requiring this adult to sign a piece of paper declaring that they have no income. Otherwise, it's not clear in the client file if you just forgot to ask about a particular adult's sources of income or if they actually have no income. And so, like I was saying earlier, each client file needs to tell the whole story of that household. And so when you're looking at a file and you are not the intake worker, you don't necessarily know that person and you don't know that household situation, and file has to be able to speak for itself. So if somebody in the household is an adult and they don't have any income, that in and of itself needs to be documented in the file. just the absence of income documentation for an adult is not sufficient to show that they have no income, because I don't know if it's because they truly have no income or if you just failed to ask them about it. And if you are not currently doing this and you would like a sample no income form, you can contact your LIHEAP regional liaison. We have some templates that we can share with you. Next, the client file needs to have evidence of income calculation. So every client file, you have to calculate their income in order to determine whether that household is income eligible or not. However, you need to show in the file the steps you took to get to that total household monthly, quarterly, or annual income, whichever you use. That math should be clear to someone and should be easily duplicated by someone who isn't familiar with the program. I've seen people use, just calculator tape that's taped into the client file, because that's what they did to calculate the income. We recommend using something like an income calculation worksheet. We have a sample of that posted on our website in the IM on best practices. This worksheet is Excel-based, and so the formulas are already built in, and you can just fill out the worksheet with everyone's income sources, and it calculates the income automatically. Then you can just print that out and put that in the client file. That way you can minimize the amount of human error in calculating household income. You can also use computer software or database to calculate income, in which case you should really have that laid out in your policies and procedures so that somebody reviewing the file knows that that is done automatically in your database. But you should have something in the file that shows how income was calculated. You shouldn't just have a line item that says household monthly income and a number that appears there. It should be very clear to an outside reviewer of your files how you arrived at that number. And the reason that's important is, when you have more than one intake worker, it's really important that all the intake workers are using the same formulas and the same calculations to calculate income. Everyone's rounding at the same place, because you really don't want to be in a situation where someone is right at the margin of being eligible and is denied because one intake worker, rounded up and another intake worker rounded down. You want to make sure that the calculations that take place for all intake workers are consistent throughout your entire service territory, whether that be a state or a tribe. You need to have something in the client file that designates whether or not this is a crisis situation, a life-threatening crisis situation, or just a regular LIHEAP assistance. And the reason for that is that if it is a crisis situation or a life-threatening crisis situation, additional documentation would be required, and an outside reviewer would need to know whether or not they should be looking for that documentation. So if your definition of a crisis involves having to have a shutoff notice, then you would also have to include that shutoff notice in the client file. It's also really important to document your timely intervention in a crisis or life-threatening crisis situation. As many of you know, there are time limits involved in intervening in a crisis and life-threatening crisis situations. You have to provide some sort of intervention within 48 hours for a crisis situation and within 18 hours for a life-threatening crisis situation. Well, that intervention and the time frame it took to perform that intervention should both be documented in the client file. And the intervention can be as simple as, we called the power company and we got them to make sure that the client didn't get shut off until we've processed their application. That can be documented by the intake worker in a notes section with a date and time. So we know that from the point of intake or from the point of eligibility determination, that intake worker responded in the appropriate amount of hours. In most cases, this is work that's being done by every intake worker, but most often it is not shown in the client file. So really this is about giving yourselves credit for the work that you're doing in the file. Again, it's very important for someone to be able to see the process of the LIHEAP application through the client file without anyone having to sit and explain it to you. And so if you had to sit and explain to me what kind of crisis intervention you took and how quickly you took it, then your client file is not adequately detailed because it really should be speaking for itself without needing somebody else to explain the documents or explain the process. You, of course, need vendor information in your client file. So whoever it is that is being paid, if it's a particular power company or a propane dealer or a gas company, that information needs to be present in the client file. If you require intake workers to get signed off on each of their files from their supervisors, that should also be evident in the file, whether that's like 2 sets of initials or signatures. That should be in every file if that's a requirement of your program. You should also include copies of all of the documents that you send to the client. If you send them a notification of approval or a denial letter or a pending or incomplete letter, all of that documentation should be in the client file so that we can see what decision was made, when the client was informed, if it was mailed to the right address, etc., etc. So copies of all the materials that are given to the client should also be in the file. Finally, you should have the documentation of the benefit payment in the file. So if that's a copy of a check or a batch report, stapled to several client files, that information needs to be part of the file so that we can see that not only did you determine eligibility and identify appropriate benefit amount, but that benefit was actually paid to the client or to the vendor, as the case may be. So going through this long list of items, it becomes necessary to try to keep track of all of this information. And as I was saying before, it's very important that files are consistent in the information that you're collecting and the order that they're presented in. So we really recommend that intake workers adopt a checklist for every client file to help them keep track of all of the required information and the order that it should go into the client file. That way you can make sure that everything that needs to be in there really is in there. And that's really the first step of what an internal monitoring process would look like. The first step is to make sure that every intake worker is successfully, documenting everything that is required in a client file. And you do that by providing them a tool such as a checklist. Then we would also expect that apart from providing intake workers with that tool, that a sample of files be reviewed internally by your own program. They can be reviewed by supervisors, or one intake worker can review another intake worker's client files and vice versa. They can be reviewed by staff from a different grant program who are familiar with social services but not necessarily with LIHEAP. or they can be reviewed by external auditors if your program is set up that way. But here are some things that we recommend that you look at when you're reviewing client files to make sure that everything is complete and correct. First, you want to make sure that all of the identity verification information is complete. If you require IDs for everyone in the household, make sure there's IDs there for everyone. If you require Social Security numbers or Social Security cards for the applicant only or all household members, you make sure that all of that is present in the file and that you can clearly read what's on those cards, and that same information is appropriately transcribed on the application form itself. Next, you want to make sure that the eligibility determination is accurate. In other words, is all the income documentation present? Did the intake worker do the calculations correctly? Did they add all the pay stubs in correctly? Did they make the appropriate withholdings if you have rules about counting some income and not other income? And did they do the math right? Not only is it important to make sure all the documents are there, it's also important to make sure that you double check the actual calculations themselves to make sure that the math itself is accurate, so that people aren't accidentally being qualified or denied based on somebody's math mistakes. Then once you have their eligibility determination taken care of, you should make sure to check that the benefit determination was done accurately. In other words, did they give them the appropriate benefit amount, or did they accidentally give them a higher amount or a lower amount? This is something you need to double check when you're doing client file monitoring. If they have a bill in there that says that they're an electric household and they received the benefit based on fuel oil, that would be a mistake. And you need to make sure that that their benefit is properly aligning with all the documentation that's in the file. You need to make sure that the benefits were received in a timely manner and that the file itself was processed in a timely manner. If you have rules that say, that each file must be processed within 30 days, then you need to make sure that, the benefit and eligibility determinations are made within 30 days of the date of the application. You also need to make sure that the crisis intervention is documented and that the intake worker responded in a timely manner, depending on whether it's a crisis or a life-threatening crisis. Finally, you need to look at all of the documents that are required from the client to make sure that everything is as it should be. So if you have a client who has their utilities included in the rent, and you know that you require a lease agreement to be included in the client file, you need to make sure that there's a lease agreement in there. Make sure that everything is legible and that photocopies aren't, skewed or confusing, or you ran out of toner and when you printed something out, you could barely read it. If you require evidence of home ownership, make sure that there's some sort of evidence from the assessor's office or a mortgage statement or some such information. If you require evidence of medical need, make sure there's a doctor's note or a self-certification of medical need in the file. You should also make sure that old files are disposed of according to your retention policy. So part of your file monitoring would be to ensure that, if you've decided that you're keeping files for 3 years, go through your cabinets and make sure that you don't have files on hand older than 3 years. And if you do, they should be disposed of, by shredding or another method that destroys all that personally identifiable information. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about what we look at when we go out to do site visits. When our office does site visits, we review a certain number of client files for a tribe, and we take multiple local agencies for a state and review their client files. So these are the kinds of things that we look at. We read your policies and procedures and try to figure out what requirements you have for each client file. So if you don't have written requirements, that's a first flag. We highly encourage everyone to have the policies of what is required to be in a client file clearly written down. And then we look at your client files to see if you are following your own policies. We make sure all the documents that are supposed to be there are there, that the file is complete and that it's accurate. We redo all of your calculations to determine eligibility. We want to make sure that our math matches your math, and that we follow your formulas and your policies for how to determine eligibility to make sure that we are able to duplicate what you have done. We look at your benefit payment matrix and compare that to the benefit determination in the client files that we look at to make sure that all of your benefit determinations are consistent with the matrix that you provided and you said you'd be using. And finally, we look at your crisis files to see if A, we can determine that there was a crisis, and B, if all of the appropriate documentation for a crisis or a life-threatening crisis is in the file, including evidence of what intervention was taken and that the appropriate time frame for that intervention was documented in the file. We also look at the payment process for that file. So it's particularly helpful when we can see copy of a check or a purchase order copy or a batch report in a client file to show that this is the amount of funding that went out, this is to whom it went out to, this is when it went out, and we also have our financial analysts then compare that to your general ledger to make sure that those checks were actually recorded and that those funds were used for that purpose. And now I will entertain any questions that anybody has on client files.
Thank you very much, Julia. Okay, we have our first question. Hold on just a second.
Hi, this is Lee Ivinson with Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. Going back to the area of calculating the income calculations, Yulia, you had mentioned that there is a spreadsheet available for calculating income. Where is that form available? I have one in Excel that I created myself, but I wanted to compare it to this best practices sheet.
Sure. On our website, if you go into the information memoranda section, there is an information memorandum that we published earlier this year on best practices that we saw from our fiscal year 2011, 12, and 13 compliance reviews. And in that IM, we reference an income calculation spreadsheet that is used by the state of Rhode Island. And that spreadsheet itself is an attachment to that information memorandum.
Okay, thank you.
And if you can't find that, contact your liaison and they'll be able to send you a link.
Okay, I'm going to let the next person ask a question.
Hi, I just have a question. Our program, we use a voucher sheet for payment. On that voucher sheet is the client's name, the utility company's name, along with the representative at the utility company that we talked to, the date we process the application, the dollar amount, it indicates whether it was a crisis, regular, etc. Is that enough?
That sounds good. Without actually seeing it, it's hard for me to tell, but it seems like you're covering all of your bases.
Great. Thank you.
Ready for the next question.
Hello, this is Angelique with Fosco Social Services down in Tucson. My question is, can you please elaborate a little bit more on the documentation of household size? What type of documentation is allowable under this eligibility requirement?
So there's nothing in the LIHEAP statute or regulations that says this is the end-all, be-all of what has to be in a client file. So all of this presentation basically comprises our recommendations. But generally speaking, what we recommend is that household size is documented by more than just the client writing the number of people in the household on the application. So that can be as simple as also having them write everybody's names and dates of birth. There could be a requirement to provide everyone's Social Security numbers or Social Security cards. Basically something more than just, there's 4 people in my household, so I just wrote the number 4 on the application. Because you really have no way of knowing if it's 4, if it's 2, or if it's 6. And so at least if they're writing down people's names and dates of birth and Social Security numbers, there's, it shows it creates perception with the client that, they can't just make something up.
Okay, thank you for the clarity.
Mm-hmm.
This is Lana from the Delaware Nation in Oklahoma. What was the time frame for the crisis intervention?
Sure. This actually is in the LIHEAP statute, so this is not a recommendation. This is a requirement. The requirement is that within that there is some kind of intervention that takes place for a crisis situation within 48 hours of the determination of eligibility. And if it's a life-threatening crisis, that needs to take place within 18 hours. And so what you need to make sure that you have is a definition for crisis and for life-threatening crisis. And these are questions that we ask you to provide in your fiscal year 15 plan, because it's important for you to know if you have 48 hours to intervene or 18 hours to intervene. So those are the time frames.
Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to clarify something. If a client has no source of income, we need to have a document or template for them to declare they have no income and have them sign it as well?
Yeah, our recommendation is that you have a zero income statement, because then if you have somebody looking at a client file who's not familiar with your program or your clients, like say your auditor, if you don't have any documentation in the file at all, the assumption is you forgot to ask or you forgot to get it, right? And so you want to have something in there that says, no, I did ask and I did get it, and the answer was there's no income. So people have asked me, if somebody comes in to apply and say there's 3 adults in the household and 1 adult comes in to apply, do you have to have the other 2 adults come in if they have zero income to sign the form? And we don't really see that as a requirement, but there should be a document that the applicant signs that says, I'm certifying that this adult in my household has no income.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is Patricia Davidson. I am with Tazwood Community Services in Tazewell, Woodford County, Illinois. And you had mentioned about the mailed items, the approval letters and things like that that go out. That is an automatic thing that happens in our state through the computer system. That's not something that we go back or that we mail ourselves. It doesn't happen at our agency level.
Right.
So is that something that we should be going back and printing to put in the actual file of the client?
No, I don't think that would be necessary. If it's something that you could look up in a database, then
Absolutely.
that works just as well. But because this particular webinar was being targeted to our tribal grantees, many of whom don't have databases, that's why I talked about it in that fashion. So if the database is there, and oftentimes what we do when we review client files in agencies that use databases is we ask for, the paper file, and then we also ask for like a guest access to your database. And so we can verify, everything in the database and everything on paper matches and follow things through.
So when you come in to audit the files, you actually, with the application ID number, would reference back and forth between what's in our computer system and what's in the file, so the story kind of unfolds for you a little more. Okay,
absolutely.
Thank you.
And I would highly encourage you that when you're monitoring your own files, that not only are you just looking at the papers, but also making sure that what gets entered into the database matches what gets put in on paper, because it's very easy, to switch numbers around. People make mistakes all the time when they type, except in LIHEAP, if you, put in the wrong number, that's the difference between eligible and not eligible. So we really encourage you, if when you're doing your own, internal review of your own intake workers, that you're looking at more than just a paper file, that you're also comparing it to the data entry that they do into the database.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you.
This is just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, just press 01. Here's the next question.
Good morning or afternoon. This is Lorraine from Hoh River out here in Washington. I have a question for you, Yulia. We are talking about the payment documentation. Now, here at Hoh, when the client is approved, we send a letter to the client that says they're approved, and then along with the check to the PUD, we write a letter to the PUD stating the client's name and the account number and how much the award was. Now, I wanted to know if this letter was going to be good enough for the file, or we serve about 29 clients per year here, and so our accounting department has their own fiscal management. So if we were to be audited, would it be okay if we went to the accounting department and said, okay, well, I need my GL for LIHEAP 2013 for the auditor. Now, do I need to go ahead and ask them for a separate GL, or when I need it, can I go to them and ask them for it?
So there were two questions there.
Okay.
One was the letter to the utility vendor sufficient? And I think the answer to that question would be yes.
Okay.
And then the second question was, do you need the GL every time you process a payment or just once for audit purposes? And I would say, given that you're only serving 29, 30 clients a year, getting it once for audit purposes would be sufficient. There's no reason to print out your general ledger and put it in the client file, no.
Okay. Thank you.
As long as the general ledger is readily available when you do need it.
Okay. And it pretty much is. We just have to ask them for it. And give
right, of course.
Oh, I did have one more question if I have time.
Sure.
Now, I'm looking at our application, and we do need to add line items for the household numbers, or the household members, the name and the birth date kind of a thing. And so for documentation for that, proof of address for all the members living in the house is what I was going to. Would it be okay, like if a lot of our kids here get free lunch and things like that, so if I could have, the utility company is going to have the name of the client, and the mom and the dad or the guardians or whoever is going to be on the utility company bill, because that's a requirement out here, is that in order for us to pay your LIHEAP, your name has to be on the account. It's part of our policy.
Okay.
Now, with that, could we use the free lunch award that the parents get from the schools out here, like when they have to apply for free lunch for the kids with the federal dollars? Would that be okay?
I don't think you need to actually document the existence of the children unless you feel like you need to. Sometimes that's a good idea in communities where there's a lot of like shared custody, and you want to make sure that, you know, the mom doesn't come in and claim her 2 kids and then later the dad comes in also claiming the same 2 kids. But I'm not saying that you need to, you know, document the existence of children per se. I mean, some grantees do require that you provide Social Security cards or birth certificates for all the children in the household. That is not a federal requirement, but many grantees do require that, and if you're going to require it, then there should be those documents in the file. But I would say, generally speaking, you should at least ask for information like names and dates of birth, so that there's something in the client file that says, you know, we asked them to write down everyone in the household, not just make up a number to put in a box.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Candy Sopp from the Heuristic Band of Micmacs. And my question is about income verification. Currently, we have a place on our application that talks about income, but it doesn't say specifically does every household member or does all the adults. All it says is name of persons receiving income, the income source, how often, and how much. Will that suffice for record-keeping purposes?
I mean, I would really encourage you to adopt the usage of a zero income statement if you have a lot of cases of households where there are adults who are claiming that they have no income. Because if someone just takes a look at your files and sees that there are 4 adults in the household and income for only 2 of them, the assumption is you forgot to ask about the other 2. So you should have some sort of documentation for each adult that demonstrates, you know, either what their income is or the fact that they have no income. You shouldn't just skip an adult.
Okay. And the other thing, on documenting people in the household, we do ask in case we have a lot of cases where children get shuffled around a lot. Parents here, and we do ask for proof of guardianship.
Right.
In cases where we know that parents or children have been shuffled from household to household.
Right.
And I do submit I verify Social Security numbers while they're on the application. And I send over the list of service Social Security numbers to the local CAP agency to make sure that we're not duplicating services.
Good for you.
So when that comes into question, we make sure if there's a question about which household a child belongs in, we do ask adults to supply us with proof, but only if there's a question.
Right, and so I think what you're doing is relatively common in communities where there's a lot of, like you say, shuffling. So I don't think it's necessarily required to have every family submit evidence of guardianship, but in most tribal communities, the communities are small and you know who you're dealing with. So if you're aware of these kinds of situations, it's perfectly reasonable to have a policy to ask for separation documents or guardianship documents that demonstrate who has custody of the child.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think what you're doing is reasonable.
Thank you.
Hello?
Oh, hi, sorry. This is Kaylee with Canna. I have a question. The no income declaration, is that better to have in the application at the beginning or something to give them if they state they don't have any?
I think it should be a separate form, but that's just my personal thought. You know, you can try out both and see what works better for you. It makes more sense to me as separate form because, you know, you'll have documentation like pay stubs for one person and a Social Security benefit letter for another person, and then you'd have this other form for the person with no income. But I've seen it both ways. It just kind of makes more sense to me as a separate form. But I do know that, you know, LIHEAP comes with a lot of forms, and there are lots of grantees try to sort of minimize the amount of paper that they're using. So if you think it would work easier or better just having it on the application, feel free to try it out and see how it goes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I have a question. I'm going back to documenting your files as far as being in crisis. When it comes to just a regular LIHEAP file, we do our furnace files a little different, but regular LIHEAP file, we usually just put like a code on the top of the tab of the file. Are you saying that we need to go a little bit further and have a form or something in there?
Do you mean just to demonstrate that it's a crisis file?
Right, that they're either disconnected or in jeopardy of being disconnected. We document them two different ways. The ones that are disconnected, we'll put RA on the tab, and the ones that are about to be disconnected, we'll put IM for intimate.
So I think as long as it's clear what all the codes mean, that's perfectly legitimate. But then we would also expect to, have the shutoff notice in there, or the, the disconnection notice. So it's not just sufficient to simply put those letters on there and not have the appropriate documentation. But do you need a separate piece of paper that says the word crisis on it? I mean, no, I don't think that's what I was saying. I think what you're doing with the stickers and the codes is reasonable, as long as everyone knows what the stickers and the codes mean.
Okay, we do, we put the disconnect if the customer has it, but in our state, with our computer system, it actually communicates with the utility company, and it tells us if they're in jeopardy of being disconnected. Because sometimes, we all got the customers who throw these pieces of paper away.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually noted on the screen that is actually either disconnected or in jeopardy of being disconnected too. But if we have the disconnect notice, we do put it in there, but sometimes the customers don't have it.
I think in the cases where customers don't have it, it would behoove you to print that screen out and put it in the client file.
Okay, and that screen is printed, yes. Okay.
Yeah, something. There needs to be something.
Okay, sounds good.
Hello, this is Angelique with FOSPA Social Services down in Tucson with one more question for you.
Sure.
Going back to what every client file should contain, I know you mentioned a little bit, you talked a little bit about the vendor information.
Mm-hmm.
If we have a copy of the bill itself and it does contain all the pertinent, all the information for the vendor, is that suffice, or do we need to actually go further and somehow identify it in another form?
No, I think that would be fine.
Okay.
I think any time you can satisfy multiple requirements with one piece of paper, that's good.
Okay.
I mean, I don't want LIHEAP to be responsible for deforestation, right? So I'm not saying that every single item on the slide needs its own paper or its own form. This is just all kind of pieces of information that should be in the file, and if multiple pieces of information are on one piece of paper, then, all the better.
Okay. And then also one more question, if I may ask. I know you had mentioned that we should put in our file when we do submit or when we mail out the approval notices or denial notices, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have to put, because we do actually use the sole format for all our LIHEAP client intakes. My question is, do we need to document the address we're mailing out the notices to, or because we have a database that we actually do pull the addresses from, do we have to note that, or how do you document the address that you're sending it to? Does it actually have to be in identified it within the note itself, or I just need some clarity there?
Yeah, I mean, normally these notifications have the address on the notification. And if they don't, I'm not saying necessarily that you need to change everything you're doing to include the address. But the point of the notice is to demonstrate that the client was notified on a particular date in a particular manner. So if you just print out a piece of paper with no date and no address, you could have printed out that piece of paper whenever, the day before I came to look at your files, say, for example, right? Yes. So there's not really a point in having a notification letter in the file if it doesn't demonstrate when you did something and how you did it.
Okay. Our form's actually generated by computer, so when it generates the form, it's stamp dated. So, I mean, that's somewhat helpful. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
We're down to our last question, so if you have wanted to ask a question and haven't done yet, this is your chance. It's 01 on your phone. And here, Yulia, is the last question in the queue.
Hi, this is Linda with the Yakima Nation, and I just have a question on the zero income. We receive the monthly per capitas with gaming, so that when we have on our application income and income sources, they always write per capita on there. And if they don't have any other income, we do not have to have them sign a zero income application, do we, if they say they're living only on their per capita payment?
Well, no, because that's more than zero, right?
Well, it is. But what if you only have a household of a single person and they only get $127.44?
Well, then I think as an intake worker, you should be asking additional questions such as, how do you pay the rent, and how do you pay for your groceries, and, document the responses. I mean, that's all sort of part of kind of the social work aspect of being a LIHEAP intake worker. You ask a question, you get a response. You usually don't take the response at face value. You got to think about it a little bit logically and say, can somebody reasonably survive on what you know is only $127 a month? And maybe their answer is, I'm in subsidized housing and I'm on food stamps. And, that's reasonable, but you should document that you asked that question and the response that you received.
Everything that you just asked, though, that is what's on our zero income thing. And in actuality, if there is a single person and that's all they get and they're not rooming with or a board or at, and those, we do make them sign those and answer all of those questions.
Right. And, that's all part of the intake process.
Right. Okay. Just double checking. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay. Again, we have one more question.
Sure.
I think you might have already asked this, but I just wanted to make sure. Is it a requirement to have identity verification for everyone in the household?
There are no such federal requirements. It is a requirement that you have a policy. Your policy can be to have identity verification for just the applicant or identity verification for all the household members. But whatever your policy is, when we look at your client files, we try to, we're making sure that you're following your own policies.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Andrew Freed from Cook Inlet Tribal Council. I had a question concerning the crisis, the 40-hour requirement for the crisis identified cases. If an application is turned in like on a Friday and the utility companies pretty much don't have any weekend disconnection or connection notice, and obviously if it's just turned in on Friday and we can't get into it that day, we're going to bust a 48-hour thing. So is that 40 hours, 48 literal hours, or could it be business days? So right now in my plan I have written up 2 business days?
The hours are literal hours, but they're not from the point of application. They're from the point that you have determined the client eligible. So, and again, you know, an intervention does not necessarily mean you have their bill paid. An intervention means you have done something to address their immediate need until the payment can be processed or the fuel can be delivered. Now, whether that's, you know, I don't know, loaning a space heater, giving out a blanket, making sure they can stay with somebody else, with a friend, referring them to temporary shelter. There's all sorts of interventions that can be taken that don't necessarily involve paying the vendor. But the 48 hours are not business hours or business days. They are 48 hours or 18 hours.
And from approval.
From when, right. So we get lots of questions about, well, what if the application is incomplete? And then I say, well, then you haven't determined eligibility because the application is incomplete. However, I will say that if you have somebody facing a crisis situation and their application is incomplete, you shouldn't just let them hang out in, you know, incomplete pending land for the next 30 days. Go ahead and deny the application and say, it's incomplete. Please submit another application.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, that's all the questions we have.
Wonderful.